Michael Henderson had never been one for confrontation. As he helped his sister, Governor Eleanor Henderson, move into the suburban gated community of Oak Ridge Estates, he was just grateful she'd have a place close to him after her accident. The spinal injury that had left Eleanor in a wheelchair 6 months ago hadn't diminished her fierce independence or her capabilities as the state's governor, but it had necessitated some lifestyle changes. The contractors did a great job, Michael said, testing the newly installed wooden wheelchair ramp that led up to Eleanor's front door. He'd hired the best to ensure it was both functional and aesthetically pleasing, matching the Tudor-style architecture of her new home. Eleanor nodded approvingly. "It's perfect, Mike. Thank you for handling all this while I was tied up with the education bill." She wheeled herself up the ramp with practiced ease. "I'm looking forward to some peace and quiet on weekends. No one here knows I'm the governor, and that's exactly how I want it." Michael understood his sister's desire for privacy. Since the car accident that had changed her life, Eleanor had been in the public eye more than ever. The media had documented her recovery, her return to office, her first public appearance in a wheelchair. She had handled it all with remarkable grace, turning her personal tragedy into a platform for disability advocacy, while never missing a beat in her gubernatorial duties. But everyone needed a sanctuary, and this house, with its secluded backyard and quiet street, was meant to be hers. "I've met a few of the neighbours," Michael said, carrying the last box from his car. "Seems like a nice mix. Retired couple next door, young family across the street. And the famous Oak Ridge Estates HOA." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You did read the covenant before I bought this place, right?" Michael waved a dismissive hand. "It's the usual stuff. No bright exterior paint colours, trash cans hidden from street view, lawn maintenance requirements. Nothing that should affect you." What Michael didn't mention was the thickness of the HOA rulebook he'd skimmed, or the stern-faced woman he'd spotted earlier inspecting the properties with a notepad. Eleanor had enough to worry about. The siblings spent the rest of the day unpacking and arranging furniture to accommodate Eleanor's mobility needs. By evening, they were enjoying takeout on the back patio, the stress of moving day melting away as they planned a small garden for the spring. "This place is perfect, Mike," Eleanor said, looking more relaxed than he'd seen her in months. "Close enough to the capital for work, but far enough to feel like an escape. And close enough that I can be here in 15 minutes if you need anything," Michael added. Eleanor rolled her eyes. "I may be in a wheelchair, but I'm still the same person who ran the state attorney general's office and won a gubernatorial election. I think I can manage a house." I know, Michael laughed. "You're the most capable person I've ever met. But even governors need help sometimes." Little did they know how prophetic those words would be. 3 days later, Michael received a frantic call from Eleanor. "They're tearing down the ramp, Mike, right now." Michael arrived at Eleanor's house to find 2 men with crowbars dismantling the wheelchair ramp, while a woman in a crisp pantsuit stood supervising with a clipboard. Eleanor was positioned at her front door, her face flushed with a combination of shock and fury. "What the hell is going on?" Michael demanded, rushing toward the workers. The woman stepped forward. "I'm Vivian Caldwell, HOA president. This structure was not approved by the Homeowners Association and violates our bylaws." She handed Michael a violation notice. Section 14.3 clearly states that all exterior modifications must receive written approval. This ramp affects the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. "My sister needs this ramp to enter her own home," Michael explained, struggling to remain calm. "She's in a wheelchair." Then the proper procedure would have been to submit an application with architectural drawings, Vivian replied coolly. "The committee meets on the first Tuesday of each month. You'll be welcome to present your case then, in 4 weeks. And until then," Eleanor called from the doorway, "until then, unauthorized structures are not permitted." Michael felt his hands clench into fists. The workers had already dismantled half the ramp, leaving a precarious, unusable structure. One of them at least had the decency to look uncomfortable, avoiding eye contact with Eleanor. "You can't just trap someone in their home," Michael protested. "This is her only safe entrance and exit." Vivian's perfectly manicured fingers tapped on her clipboard. "We have regulations for a reason, Mr. Henderson. Everyone in Oak Ridge Estates agreed to these terms when purchasing property here." Her gaze swept dismissively over Eleanor. "Your sister should have considered her special needs before choosing this community." A small crowd of neighbours had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Michael recognized the retired couple from next door, watching with concerned expressions. A woman pushing a stroller slowed her pace, frowning at the scene. "This is ridiculous," Michael said, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling the police." "Feel free." Vivian smiled thinly. "The HOA is well within its legal rights. We have an excellent attorney on retainer who specializes in property disputes." She nodded to the workers. "Continue, please." Eleanor wheeled herself as close to the door's edge as she could safely manage. "Vivian, is it? I understand rules are important, but surely there's room for reasonable accommodation while we follow your procedures." Vivian's posture stiffened. "Exceptions lead to chaos, Miss Henderson. First, it's an unapproved ramp. Next, it's purple front doors and lawn flamingos." Her voice carried for the benefit of the gathering onlookers. "Property values affect everyone here. The committee will consider your application when properly submitted." "And how exactly am I supposed to leave my house until then?" Eleanor asked, her governor's voice emerging, calm, authoritative, and with an edge that had made many a legislative opponent back down. "That's not the HOA's concern," Vivian replied, turning away. "Perhaps you should have thought of that before violating our covenants." Michael stepped between the workers and what remained of the ramp. "Stop. Now. You've made your point, but this has gone far enough." "Vivian, was it?" Eleanor wheeled herself forward, her voice taking on the authoritative tone that had won her debates in the state legislature for years. "I'd like to see a copy of the HOA bylaws and the board's meeting minutes from the past year." Vivian's expression tightened. "Those are available to homeowners upon written request with a processing fee." "I see." Eleanor pulled out her phone. "Then I'll just call my chief of staff and have him dispatch someone from the governor's office to collect them. I'm sure the State Housing Authority would be interested in reviewing your accommodation practices." The colour drained from Vivian's face. "The governor's office." "Yes, I'm Governor Eleanor Henderson." She handed Vivian her business card. "And while I was hoping to keep a low profile here, it seems we need to have a conversation about reasonable accommodations under the Fair Housing Act." The workers had stopped dismantling the ramp, looking uncertainly between Vivian and Eleanor. There was a moment of complete silence as the revelation sank in. One of the workers slowly set down his crowbar. The other took a step back from the half-demolished ramp. Among the small crowd of neighbours, someone whispered, "The governor," followed by the unmistakable sound of a phone camera clicking. Vivian's clipboard slipped from her grasp, clattering on the walkway. She bent to retrieve it, clearly buying time to compose herself. When she straightened, her face had shifted from confident authority to poorly concealed panic. "Governor Henderson, we had no idea. The HOA welcomes you to our community, of course, There must have been some miscommunication. She shot an accusatory glance at the workers, who both suddenly became very interested in their shoes. The only miscommunication, Eleanor replied evenly, was your failure to recognize that federal accessibility laws supersede HOA regulations. This isn't about who I am, Vivian. It's about what's legal and what's right. Michael couldn't suppress a small smile as he watched his sister transform before his eyes, from the casual weekend homeowner into the formidable state leader whose approval ratings had soared precisely because she never backed down from a fight that mattered. I can provide you with contact information for the State Attorney General's office, Eleanor continued, her phone already in hand. They can explain the financial penalties for Fair Housing Act violations. Or, she paused, looking directly at the growing number of neighbours gathered at the edge of her property. The HOA board can reconsider its position right now. One of the neighbours, an older man with a cane, stepped forward. I'm on the board, he said, and I'd like to call an emergency meeting. Tonight. Vivian's complexion had moved from pale to slightly green. We can certainly expedite your application, Governor Henderson. This isn't just about my ramp anymore, Eleanor replied, her voice carrying clearly to everyone present. It's about every person with a disability who has faced similar barriers. So yes, an emergency board meeting sounds appropriate. Michael stepped closer to his sister, recognition dawning on his face. This was no longer just a personal inconvenience for Eleanor, it had become a cause. And if there was one thing his sister excelled at, it was turning personal challenges into political movements. Should I call your office? He asked quietly. Eleanor nodded, her eyes still fixed on Vivian. Tell them to prepare a press release about discriminatory housing practices, and ask them to send over the state's ADA compliance team. It seems Oak Ridge Estates is due for a thorough review. The emergency HOA board meeting the following evening was standing room only. Word had spread quickly throughout Oak Ridge Estates that Governor Henderson was not only a resident, but was threatening legal action against the association. Michael sat beside Eleanor in the crowded community centre as Vivian called the meeting to order. The board wishes to address the unfortunate misunderstanding regarding Governor Henderson's property. Vivian began, her voice noticeably less confident than before. Misunderstanding? Eleanor interrupted. Your crew destroyed a necessary accommodation for my disability and left me unable to easily exit my home in case of emergency. That's not a misunderstanding. That's discrimination. Eleanor opened a folder containing printouts of the Fair Housing Act, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and state laws regarding reasonable accommodations. I've highlighted the relevant sections for the board's review. The HOA's attorney, hastily brought in for the meeting, whispered urgently to Vivian, who appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Oak Ridge Estates has always prided itself on being an inclusive community, Vivian said weakly. Then prove it, Eleanor challenged. Not just for me, but for every resident who needs accommodations. The tension in the room was palpable. Residents exchanged glances, some nodding in agreement with Eleanor, others looking nervously at the board members. Michael noticed several people filming discreetly with their phones. By morning, this confrontation would likely be statewide news. The HOA attorney cleared his throat and leaned toward the microphone. If I may address the situation from a legal standpoint. Please do, Eleanor replied, her expression attentive but unyielding. While the HOA covenant does require pre-approval for exterior modifications, the attorney began, choosing his words carefully. Federal law clearly establishes that reasonable accommodations for persons with disabilities must be permitted. The board should have followed an expedited approval process in this case. Vivian shot him a look of betrayal, but the attorney continued. I would advise the board to immediately authorize the rebuilding of Governor Henderson's ramp and to revise the approval process for all accommodation requests. A board member, a woman in her 60s, spoke up. I move that we approve the immediate reconstruction of the ramp at the HOA's expense and establish a committee to review our accessibility policies. Second, said the older man with the cane who had spoken up the day before. Vivian looked as though she might object, but after glancing at the attorney, she simply said, "All in favour." A chorus of ayes filled the room, followed by applause from many residents. Eleanor raised her hand, silencing the room. While I appreciate this resolution for my situation, I'm concerned about the broader pattern. How many other residents have been denied reasonable accommodations? How many didn't fight back because they lack my resources and platform? A young woman stood up from the audience. They denied my request for a support animal last year. Said pets over £20 weren't allowed, even though my doctor prescribed him for my anxiety. An elderly man raised his hand. They fined me for installing a handrail by my front steps. Had to take it down. More voices joined in, each with their own story of inflexible rules prioritized over human needs. Michael watched his sister taking notes, her expression growing more determined with each account. It seems, Eleanor said finally, when the stories had subsided, that Oak Ridge Estates has a systemic problem that goes well beyond my ramp. As a resident, I expect better. As governor, I intend to ensure better. Not just here, but across our state. The story broke in the state media the next day. Governor Henderson takes on discriminatory housing practices. Photos of the demolished ramp appeared alongside Eleanor's official portrait, creating a striking contrast that captured public attention. Michael watched as his sister transformed the personal slight into a platform for broader change. Eleanor held a press conference on her front lawn, wheelchair positioned prominently where the ramp had been. Housing discrimination affects thousands of our citizens with disabilities, she told the assembled reporters. Today, I'm announcing a new initiative to review and strengthen enforcement of accessibility requirements in residential communities throughout our state. The governor's office was flooded with calls from residents sharing similar stories of HOA obstacles to accessibility modifications. Eleanor listened to each one, compiling their experiences into what would become the foundation for new legislation. Meanwhile, at Oak Ridge Estates, the HOA board convened an emergency session to revise their bylaws, with Vivian conspicuously absent. The board voted unanimously to create an expedited approval process for accessibility modifications and to rebuild Eleanor's ramp at the association's expense. By midweek, the story had gone national. Eleanor's office had fielded calls from major news networks, disability rights organizations, and even the White House. What had begun as a neighborhood dispute had ignited a nationwide conversation about accessibility and reasonable accommodations. Michael marveled at his sister's ability to channel righteous anger into productive action. She had always been this way, even as children. When the local playground lacked accessible equipment, 11-year-old Eleanor had written to the mayor and organized a petition. Now, with the full power of her office behind her, she was a force of nature. The Housing Equality Act will require all homeowners associations to create clear, expedited processes for accessibility accommodations, Eleanor explained during an interview with the state's most-watched news program. It will establish penalties for associations that fail to comply with federal accessibility laws and create a state-level oversight committee to handle complaints. The proposed legislation gained immediate bipartisan support. Politicians from both parties recognized the simple justice of ensuring people with disabilities could access their own homes without bureaucratic barriers. Vivian Caldwell, meanwhile, had become the reluctant face of discriminatory housing practices. When she finally broke her silence in a written statement, her apology seemed more concerned with damage control than genuine remorse. The Oak Ridge Estates HOA regrets any inconvenience to Governor Henderson and is committed to reviewing our practices. The statement only fueled public indignation. Comment sections filled with stories from people who had faced similar obstacles from their own HOAs. Elderly residents unable to install handrails, veterans denied permission for accessibility modifications, families with disabled children forced to move rather than fight protracted battles over necessary accommodations. "I never wanted this kind of attention," Eleanor confided to Michael over dinner, 5 days after the incident. "But sometimes you have to use the spotlight when it finds you." Michael nodded, thinking of how his quiet, private sister had become the unlikely champion of a cause that affected countless citizens. "You know what Mom used to say," he reminded her. "If you have a platform, stand on it. If you have a voice, use it." 3 weeks later, Michael smiled as he watched a construction crew putting the finishing touches on Eleanor's new ramp. This one built to even higher specifications than the original, with gentle slopes, non-slip surfaces, and decorative elements that complemented the neighborhood aesthetic. Vivian Caldwell had resigned as HOA president, replaced by a retired architect who used a cane himself and understood the importance of accessibility. The new president stood beside Eleanor at the small ribbon-cutting ceremony organized by the neighbors. "Governor Henderson, on behalf of Oak Ridge Estates, we sincerely apologize for our previous actions," he said. "Your advocacy has opened our eyes and changed our community for the better." Eleanor nodded graciously. "This was never just about my ramp. It was about creating homes where everyone can live with dignity and independence." As residents applauded, Michael noticed a family touring a house for sale across the street, the parents pushing a child in a wheelchair. They waved at the gathering, and Eleanor waved back, a satisfied smile on her face. That evening, as they shared dinner on Eleanor's newly built back patio, expedited through the HOA's new approval process, Michael raised his glass. To making a difference, one ramp at a time. Eleanor clinked her glass against his. "Sometimes," she said thoughtfully, "it takes a personal experience to remind us why the work matters. I came here looking for a quiet retreat from being governor, but instead, I found my next mission." Michael nodded, knowing his sister well enough to recognize the determined gleam in her eye. The HOA had unwittingly unleashed one of the state's most effective advocates for change, and the impact would extend far beyond the gates of Oak Ridge Estates. The Housing Equality Act moved through the state legislature with unprecedented speed. Eleanor's personal story had put a face to an issue that had long been overlooked, and legislators from both parties rallied behind the bill. 3 months after the incident, Eleanor signed it into law at a ceremony attended by disability rights advocates from across the state. "This law ensures that no one will face the barriers I encountered," she said as cameras flashed. "Home should be a place of safety and comfort for everyone, regardless of ability." Back at Oak Ridge Estates, the changes were already visible. The young woman who had been denied her support animal now walked her golden retriever openly through the neighborhood. The elderly man had his handrail reinstalled. New residents included several families with members who had disabilities, drawn to a community that had become known for its inclusivity. Even more significant were the changes that rippled beyond their neighborhood. HOAs across the state proactively revised their bylaws, fearing they might become the next cautionary tale. The State Housing Authority, empowered by the new legislation, established a streamlined complaint process and hired inspectors to ensure compliance. 6 months after the ramp incident, Eleanor was featured in a national magazine's Changemakers issue. The article detailed how her personal experience had catalyzed statewide reform and inspired similar legislation in neighboring states. "Would you have chosen this battle?" the interviewer had asked. "I would have preferred not to be trapped in my home," Eleanor had replied with a wry smile. But once it happened, backing down wasn't an option. Sometimes leadership means turning your personal challenges into public solutions. Michael had framed that quote and given it to Eleanor as a housewarming gift for her now fully accessible home. It hung in her study, a reminder that sometimes the most meaningful changes begin in unexpected ways, even with a demolished wheelchair ramp and an HOA that picked the wrong homeowner to intimidate.